participate with us like that. So it's 1 o'clock, everyone. Welcome to the Master Gardener Book Club. We are so excited. We had a great time reading Composting for a New Generation. Where'd my book go? Oh, here it is. Yay! And you can see I've got my dog ears in there. And so we're welcoming Michelle Balz today. And Michelle, I'm just really so thrilled that you're here. We chatted a little bit before we got started. Would you mind telling us your title and where you're coming to us from today?
Absolutely. So I am in Cincinnati, Ohio. So a little colder up north here, but still a very nice day. And so professionally, my title is solid waste manager. So I manage an office, and our mission is to reduce how much waste goes to the landfill. But I actually wrote the 2 books that I wrote outside of my job as a profession working for the county, just because I have a real passion for backyard composting. So I guess my title today is author.
Author and expert. So did you go to college for waste management or around natural resources or gardening, or how did you prepare for this role?
So my undergrad, I did in environmental studies. So it was focused kind of on all the different environmental aspects. But then I went back to school later on and got a master's in professional writing and editing. So those 2 things merged into writing about the environment.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we are so thrilled to have you today. So let's see if Madeline's going to switch slides for me. There we go. So we definitely want to hear from you, Master Gardeners, as we go along. So we're going to ask you to chime in on the conversation. So be prepared to go into the chat at any moment. But as we're wrapping up, I want to remind you to not close out of the book club, because we're going to be announcing our new book title, and you all, it's going to be so great. So I'm going to tease it there, but we want you to stay tuned so you can hear about the next one. So let's hear from you. Where are you joining us from today? So if you could drop in the chat box where you were participating from, or if you want to comment on Facebook Live, where you're joining us from. I'd like to know where all of our fabulous composters are from. So Naples, Ocala, DeLand, Newport Richey, downtown Orlando, Tampa, Jacksonville, Gainesville, Jupiter, Winter Springs, Florida. And we have folks from Weston, Sarasota, Broward County, Fort Myers. Let's see, I think I might have missed one up here. Marathon, so that's down in the Keys, Michelle. And we also have, if I didn't say Panama City or Bay County, I meant. So all across Florida, from places that actually have soil to those who just live on rocks, are with us today. And so I'm coming to you from Gainesville, Florida, and Michelle said she is from Cincinnati. So we're so glad that everyone could join us. And we've got such a great group. Oop, I've got 4 more messages down here. Oh, Gadsden County, which is to the northwest of Tallahassee. And we also have folks from Lakeland, Fort Myers, Wesley Chapel, which is outside of the Tampa area, Hudson, Florida, which is on the West Coast, Melbourne, and Dothan, Alabama. And someone is from Oviedo with 3 exclamation points. And Oviedo is north of Orlando. McClenny, Florida, which is outside of Jacksonville. And yeah, we've got a fantastic sampling from all around Florida today. So I'm really excited to hear about their composting experience also. All right, let's see. Oh, New Smyrna Beach too. Oh, wow. So Michelle, I have to tell you that this was the most talked about page, image, concept of the book. We loved it. And so I just wanted to hear from you a little bit about what your experience has been with the African keyhole garden.
Absolutely. So this was one that I really wanted to explore more, and actually in the books that's going to come out next month, No Waste Composting, we did one of these projects step by step, and actually put one of these keyhole gardens together, which was really fun. But the African keyhole garden, this is a concept that obviously came out of Africa, and the idea was in the climates that they were intended for, it is rather dry and the soil wasn't really great. And so they were gardening in raised beds, and they wanted a way to be able to integrate easy gardening in those raised beds. And the compost bin provides that. So the compost bin provides water, nutrients to the plants that are surrounding it. So it's a really a great concept. And what they do is put cardboard underneath the soil that they add to even have another preventive layer of that water going down into the ground. So they really try to make it a contained environment. And when they go to water the bed, instead of actually watering around on the plants, they will water into the compost bin and then let the water come out that way. So it's a really ingenious idea. I watched videos of this village in Uganda. They were, instead of having the wire basket, they actually were weaving these plants and, kind of bamboo almost like material into a compost basket for the center. It was really cool. But if you Google this, you will see 100 different ways that you can build these bins. So, you can do it out of pavers, you can do it out of rock. The one that we built for No Waste Composting, we did out of log pieces. So the pieces around were a log, and then the cutout for the keyhole was pavers, leftover pavers that we had. And so there's lots of different ways that you can do it. I saw someone do it out of old wine bottles that they just stack together. So you can definitely get creative with this.
So for the one that you did, what type of plants did you use? Did you use vegetables or perennials, or what did you use?
So the area that we were doing it for a book, you have to remember. So we had to pick a really photographic area, but it also had to be a shady area, because when you're taking photographs, you don't want to be in direct sunlight because the lighting's too harsh. So we actually built it in a shady area. So it ended up having to be a shade garden.
Okay.
So we planted mostly perennials that were shade.
Sure, sure. I like it. So pavers are, and then with the logs, they were upright, longitudinal?
Yes. So they were stacked kind of around this way.
Very cool. Well, everybody was really interested. And then I had seen this before in permaculture. And so I was like, oh, there it is. But I think it's a little bit different, a little bit more expanded the way you described it in the book. So we really, really love that one a lot. Okay, so my question to you is, and Madeline wants to know from me as well, and I'll tell you, but how did you get interested in composting?
So two reasons. One, I had a job where I was doing a lot of waste, trying to teach people how to reduce their waste. But I bought a house, and it's an old house. I'm in it right now, but it was built in the 1920s, and it's in an urban area, and the backyard had not been touched in probably 20 or 30 years. It was completely overgrown. There were very few plants left. But the soil wasn't great. It was very heavy clay. And so by backyard composting, we were able to, over the years, add that compost to the soil and really give ourselves a much better gardening experience by having the compost in there. Right.
Well, I think I have alluded to mine, is that my mom was a real composter from the very beginning. And she loved her compost pile, and she was very active with it. But then my father started to try to compost with her, and they just really could not have a meeting of minds. So they always had his and hers compost. That was his compost pile and her compost pile. And so the way it worked out was he had a very specific way of doing things. He liked a lot of shredded paper. And she just put in everything, you know, under the sun in hers, and both of them worked. But it was just kind of a fun thing to see that kind of his and hers going on there. And then the other reason I got interested in composting is that I grew up in very South Florida, and I have a soil sample from South Florida with me. And this is the rock that we grow on. This is the person from Marathon knows what I'm talking about. It's called Miami oolite, and it's basically coral rock. And it is that's the basis for the agriculture down there. They break into the rock and the marl comes out of the rock. But over the years, soil building became a huge part of the success of my family farm, is because they built that soil. So organic matter was something that we actually talked about at the dinner table. So of course, composting has been important for a long time. And so I'm sure, you know, depending on what that soil is that you're overcoming, like you with the clay, you know, you knew. And so you probably saw that transform over the years, right?
Yes, I have. And you can, anywhere in my yard now, you can dig and you'll see a layer of the organic matter. And then below that, you can feel it with your shovel and you get down to the clay.
Right. Well, good. Very cool. Good. So this is a photo of an organic garden around the University of Florida. And it's where I was exposed to gardening or community composting, where folks composted together as a group to generate compost for the garden that they have there. And this was the first time I was exposed to someone who was the compost manager. She was in charge of all the composting that went on there, and she has a record book and a thermometer and make sure that it's hot and it's turned. And I just wonder if you have any experience with this type of community composting.
I love community composting. It has a special place in my heart because I think if you can't compost in your backyard, just like if you can't really garden in your own space, having a place in your community that you can bring your food scraps and compost with others is fantastic. And I love that this community garden had a compost manager. I think that's key. When you have a community compost site, you don't want it to be the wild, wild west where, you know, people can just throw whatever in there. It definitely needs to have good signage to make sure that everybody who's contributing to it is, you know, putting the right stuff in there,
Right.
But having someone there to make sure that it's, you know, managed so it doesn't become a nuisance, right? So it's really an asset to your community and not something that your neighbors are complaining about, I think is great. But, you know, those community gardens, they are a great place to have that wonderful soil amendment, right? Right there at your fingertips. So you can then use it to garden.
Well, and it's funny because you see they have all the bins and you can kind of see them lined up there with the pallets and the hardware screen in between. But the where it says active, where you can take, it's always dug out very to the bottom. Everybody's using it and they're waiting for it to get turned into the one that they can go ahead and make withdrawals from. So you know how important it is for that. All right. So, you know, as an extension agent, I encourage people to be more sustainable in their landscape. And I talk about mulching and I talk about water conservation and putting the right plant in the right place. People are all on board on that. And when we talk about rain barrels, folks will say, oh, okay, you know, they might make that next step to the rain barrel. But one of the bigger barriers that we have is around composting. And I know that's your job to encourage people to compost. So what are some of the words that you use and how can we encourage more folks to compost?
This is a great question. So I started a blog in 2009 about backyard composting called Confessions of a Composter. And I did it because I saw this need where people sometimes would start composting, they'd have a bad experience, they didn't do it right, and then they would just stop and they wouldn't want to keep going. And so I think that there's just a few simple rules, a few things that you need to follow. And composting is very forgiving, right? The material you put in there, it is going to turn into finished compost, whether it goes through a stinky phase or not. But what I like to say is when you are composting, you know, if the only thing that you do is always bury your food scrap with leaves, then you're going to end up with great compost and you're not going to have odor. So being able to have just a few simple rules that you follow and a few reminders, I think really helps people. So, composting is forgiving. It's going to turn into compost whether you're, working actively on it or not. And it really is easy to do. It becomes part of your routine. When I go on vacation, it is so hard for me to throw away a banana peel. I'm like, oh, this could have been a great soil amendment, but now it just has to, die in the landfill. So
do you hold it and hesitate over the garbage?
I do. It's really hard for me. I've honestly thought about packing it back in my suitcase with me. But I do think that once you really get into the routine, it just becomes part of what you do. And so I feel like you just need to get into the routine of it, and then it's so easy and simple and just second nature.
Yeah. Right. Yep. I think that's great advice. I really appreciate that. And we'll be able to share that with folks too, that it's not as hard as it looks. And there's really no wrong way of doing it. And so I was wondering if anyone else has a hard time throwing things away that are compostable. So if you do, drop it in the chat. Suzanne, yes, Suzanne, with emphatic yeses. Yeah, for sure. And so, Michelle, I think one of the things we joked about at the beginning of book club is that I got the book, and before I read it completely, I read the table of contents. And I got so inspired just by the table of contents. I was like, I'm going to start composting again, because I actually took quite a break. I was like, I'm not going to wait until I have the perfect bin. I'm just going to start composting right now. And I was so inspired just by the table of contents, but I really wanted to talk to you about the process of writing this book. It is not a thin little picture book. I mean, you put a lot of work in here, and I just wanted to ask your process about putting together all this great information.
Yeah, so it was really helpful to have had a good 10 years under my belt with the blog. And so I had written about a bunch of different topics that I felt were important, and done a lot of thinking about backyard composting and what people need to do to get started. I've taught hundreds of classes on backyard composting. And so having that experience, I already had a good kind of infrastructure in my brain of what people need to know to backyard compost. And then, the publisher came to me, and I tend to be kind of a minimalist communicator. So I want to just tell you what you need. And I have a bunch of other things I could tell you, but our composting seminars are under an hour. So we try to get people, this is what you need to do. And so the publisher came to me with other ideas to try to add more to the book. And so, but from the original outline, I also, when I would go and try to be learning about one thing I had in the outline, someone would teach me about something else. And so, for example, I knew I wanted to do the African keyhole garden. Mm-hmm. And so I went with one of my friends who is really big into community gardening and had built an African keyhole garden. And he's like, let's go over a few blocks. I had this other garden where I built hugelkultur, where you bury the rotting wood underneath the ground. And so he taught me all about that, and I got to see that in action. And so I ended up writing a section of the book about it. And then in No Waste Composting, my next book, we went through from beginning to end a hugelkultur mound, and actually got to see someone doing it in a raised bed, which was really cool. Ooh, cool. So things kind of grew off of what my originally, I probably would have been like a 50-page book, but it ended up being a 200-page book.
Right. We were wondering, what's the name of the next book again?
It's called No Waste Composting, and it's part of a No Waste series that Cool Springs Press has done. But No Waste Composting is the next book, and it was supposed to be on shelves right now, but because of COVID, it was stuck on the West Coast on a ship. So it's supposed to be in shelves early April.
Okay. Oh, that's really exciting. I'm really excited about that. So there's a A lot of different composting methods. What do you think the most common mistake people make is?
Not burying their food scraps, I think, would be number one. So, whenever you look in your compost bin, you should not be able to see banana peels or broccoli, sticking out. If you bury everything, then fruit flies, they don't burrow down into your bin, so you're not going to have all of the problems with fruit flies flying in your face. Which fruit flies are really just a nuisance. They're not hurting your compost; they're just annoying to you. But I would say, I know you said one, but tumblers, if you have a tumbler compost bin, the biggest mistake people make there is they forget to add browns. So they forget to add leaves, and they end up with kind of a slushy food scrap mess without adding the leaves in there. So you really do need to add the brown material, the shredded paper or the leaves, in order to make that beautiful finished compost we're looking for.
Good. So yeah, so kind of what I hear you saying is not hot enough, and then maybe just going too much on the food scrap side. And I don't want to, and I love what you said in the book about, don't stay up at night worrying about the ratio. You don't need a calculator for this. You can figure it out, so, but yeah, if it's stinky and gross and too much food, you put some leaves in there, we have pine needles a lot in my area. So I love to put the pine needles in. That helps a bunch also. So that is really good advice for getting that temperature up and getting the tilth up. And so the next photo I have to share with you is kind of what our soils look like here. This is what we cope with. You've got your clay up there, but we've got these deep sandy soils here in Florida, and it is a real challenge because there's no organic matter in there at all. And then when we do add organic matter, it just slips away. So when I'm teaching vegetable gardening, we talk about adding about 1 pound of organic matter per square foot of garden per season. And then you go back the next season, it's like it's gone. It oxidizes off. But the more compost we can add, the better. And I just wanted to kind of give you a little snapshot, a cutaway snapshot. And if it doesn't look like this, it's all raw. It's rock, like I showed you before. So we really need composting in Florida for sure. And it really can make all the difference in the world. All right. So for our folks out there, and this is going to go right along with our chat, and I'm gonna let you know. So do you have any simple hacks that make composting easier for you? And I saw a great one here. Janice, I agree with you. I love this idea that you came up with. And there are issues with rodents and critters in many of our situations. She went to a recycling store called the Repurpose Project and bought used trash cans, drilled holes in the bottom, and that's become her compost bin. So she's composting in a compost bin and letting that air get turned out, and that way she's keeping the critters out, which is awesome. And then there are folks who are using down trees from hurricanes in their hugelkultur and having really good luck with it. So kind of that recycling of the logs and composting is great. And one of the things I do, because I'm a little bit lazy, if I have to admit it, when I start to get fruit flies on my kitchen counter collector, I put the collector, which is a big Tupperware, into the freezer. If I can't make it the 100 steps to my compost pile, I can make it the 5 steps to my freezer and freeze it, and then that way the fruit flies go away. Have you ever heard of that, Michelle?
I have, yeah. I one of my coworkers, that's what she does, because she only takes her compost out about once a week, and so she says it's her lazy way of composting, but it works great actually to do that.
And another hack that was shared with me a long time ago, and this was a little too much for me. I couldn't do it in my life, but she, and you mentioned it in the book as well, she puts stuff in the blender before she puts it into the compost pile. And I thought, well, that's over the top. And I said, and don't invite me for daiquiris. And she's, She said, I have a garage blender and I have a kitchen blender. So you're welcome to come for daiquiris at any time. I'm like, okay, good. So do you ever do that? Do you do the blender trick?
I do not. That's kind of next level composting. You're definitely going to have finished compost faster if you do that. I mean, it's a great trick. I just don't have time in my life for blending food scraps. You know, I have 2 little kids and I'm pretty busy. So,
Life goals. These are life goals.
right. Yeah. Maybe someday I'll do that. I'll have my garage blender and I'll drink my daiquiri out there.
Yeah. That's a good idea. John, I like that question about having, he's talking about folks who have very small lots or apartments. You know, what do you think about small scale composting, or what would you recommend for apartment dwellers or people who are on very small lots?
So that is actually a focus of my next book, The No Waste Composting. So here's another reason why you should read it. So I put in there, I really wanted to think about people who had small lots and didn't want to take up, my backyard is pretty small, but I have like 4 composters in it. I'm the exception. So I even included methods in there for people who just have a terrace or a patio, you know, that they could compost. So there's a few ideas. There's one method that I used where that's really popular in India and Peru, and it's using terracotta pots. So you stack these terracotta pots on each other. And the nice thing about terracotta is that it's breathable. And you use coconut core, or, you know, like the outside of the coconut that's not the part that they
Right,
don't
the
use,
fiber, right?
the fibers, right? As your brown. So if you don't have a very big yard, or say if you're in a place that, you know, you don't have much leaves, such as a lot of Florida, then you can use this coconut fiber as your brown. So it's it smells really lovely when you're when you're putting it in there. But I had one of these composters. I actually kept it in my kitchen for a few months because I wanted to see how much it would smell. I wanted to test it, and it didn't smell at all. It was amazing. So I bought one online, but then in No Waste Composting, I put together some DIY instructions of how you could make your own out of old terracotta pots, stacking them on top of each other. So that's one idea. You can also do vermicomposting. So vermicomposting can be in a small little Tupperware container. You use red wigglers, so you use a special worm, but those worms will eat half their body weight in food scraps a day. So they can really go through a lot of food scraps. And the compost that comes off of vermicompost is the most nutrient rich compost that you can create. And so that vermicomposting is a great option. And then there's also something called bokashi that you can do, which is really popular in Japan, where you ferment food scraps. And so it's also a small kind of contained experience. So there's a few options in the book. I also, I know one woman mentioned that she had created her own compost bin out of an old garbage can, and that I have a DIY instructions for that too in the book. So, so I think that is also another small, you know, you can tuck it away somewhere. It doesn't have to be out permanently in your garden.
I love it. That's great. Janice, I like to use earthworms too in my own environment. I think earthworms are great as well. So that's good. All right, let's go for our next one. Let's see. And Madeline just loves this picture, our producer. So I'm thinking, you know, what does this say about Madeline? She loves composting and she loves gardening. So it's fun. And but this is a lot of food scraps. But what made me think about this was the compost fork. And so, Michelle, my question for you and for the folks out in Facebook land, as well as on our chat box, what is your favorite composting tool?
That's a good question. So I was very excited the day I got my first pitchfork. My husband got it for me, I think as a birthday present, but it's not my favorite. I mean, I do love my pitchfork, don't get me wrong. I think that my favorite composting tool is called a wing digger. Mm-hmm. And so it's basically a fancy metal stick that has these little wings on the end. And they're really nice if you're using one of kind of the pre-manufactured black plastic composters, because you just kind of stab it into the bin and it gets the air down into, yeah. And it's a great tool because it's fun to use, right? You can get a little aggression out stabbing your bin, but it's a little easier in that setting than the pitchfork. It's hard to get a pitchfork down into one of those bins.
Right.
So I think that has been my favorite compost tool besides my composter itself.
Okay, we're going to talk about, well, you want to tell us which composter you like to use?
So like I said, I have 4 compost bins right now in my backyard. I think my favorite though is my original one. And it's one of the black plastic ones. The brand is called a Soil Saver. But any of the black plastic ones, I think that they just work really well because they hold in moisture, they hold in heat, and it's about the right size for a family for, food scraps. You're not going to fit all your yard trimmings likely in there, but I think it's a good size. It's easy to manage. So I would say that's my favorite of my compost bins, but don't tell my other ones that.
Okay, no, I won't mention it. I think for me, I almost like to have 2 of those, one that's active and one that's sort of resting or ready to use. Do you agree?
Absolutely. That's the easiest way to compost, is if you have 2, because then you don't have to remove the half rotted stuff to get down to the good stuff. It's just all good stuff.
Great. We had Suzanne is sharing a great tip, and I love it. And that is that she keeps her compostables, instead of a kitchen counter composter bin, she has Ziploc bags, and she puts it in the fridge until she can get out to the compost pile and make her deposit of goodness. I love that. That's awesome. No more smell, no more bugs. So great idea. All right. So for us, there are rules, and it was funny when I taught composting when I was out at the county office, and it was interesting because we had I had 15 people in a composting class, and I said, if you ask 15 people how to compost, you're going to get 20 different ways to compost. Everybody's got their own style, but there are certain rules that kind of go through the whole concept of composting. We talk about definitely avoiding meat products, oil products, citrus, and yet I see people breaking the rules and still coming up with great compost. So what do you think about these rule breakers?
I love it. So if you're brave enough to break the rules, go for it. And I will say, there's the rules are in place, especially the no meat. They're in place, especially for beginner composters, to make sure that you don't have a bad experience. If you put meat into your compost, it's probably going to smell. It likely will attract rodents to your compost. And so that's why the rule is in place. But that meat is going to break down. It's going to become finished compost. So, I think it's really a situation by situation basis. So if you are in a really rural area and that's not going to matter, having a little bit of odor, or if you have a lot of browns that you can use to cover it up. There are places that compost, animal remains, as their job. And they have methods of doing that to where it's going to get hot enough and it's going to compost really quickly. So really the rules are there to keep people, to make it easier in the beginning, I think. Right. But the better you get at composting, the easier it will be to break those rules.
Yeah, and I think some of those rules that if you break them, you have immediate consequences, like you do have that smell or you do have the bugs, and then you're like, oh, I probably shouldn't do this next time. And that community garden I had showed the picture of earlier, they put in their like a 4x4 air compost spot zone. They'll put in like 20 pounds of lemon rinds that come from a lemonade stand. And I was always taught, especially here in Florida, where we do sometimes have excess citrus from juicing or from like lemonade stands or from byproducts of the juice, to not put that much acid. And I always say, oh, you shouldn't put that much acid in. And they're like, okay, whatever, we're still going to do it. And their compost comes out great. So, but one thing I know for sure, I composted with the former friend, and you'll know why they're former in a minute. And that was, they had we had a large oyster party, and all the shucked oyster shells, before I knew it, went into my compost pile. I was so aggravated, you know, I mean, and they're like, oh, it's organic, it'll break down, it's good for the calcium. I'm like, no, I don't think so. No. So it took me a day of picking oyster shells out of my compost. That was not fun. So, but I know people do like to kind of push the limits. And you said earlier, compost is forgiving. It'll forgive you, right? So, I want to, does anybody out in the chat land know of any rules that have been broken?
And Wendy, Michelle, we have a couple extra questions in the chat. Do you have a couple minutes to answer those?
Sure. Okay. And I am going to, oh, this is such a, Judy, I really love this question. Some things break down faster than others. I've noticed that native plants seem to break down faster than non-natives. What do you think?
Interesting observation. I've not noticed that. But I wonder if it's just because they're used to that climate. And so that's, you know, their natural climate. So that's what they would naturally do, right? So I have no scientific proof of that, but it's an interesting observation.
I like that response though. Very elegant. I like that. Very good. And Jennifer, it brings up something that's been on my mind too, which is she'd love to use compost as mulch. And she hadn't heard about that until she read it in this book. And what are you, I have a story about this, but you go ahead and talk about it.
So I have a little bit of a love affair with my finished compost, and I like to spread it, you know, where people are going to see it, right? And so I put it, you know, in one of the most prominent beds, you know, as mulch often. And I think it's a nice way. I mean, the organisms that are in the soil are going to eventually be pulling it down into the soil. And so I think that it's a nice way to use your finished compost. It's easier. You're not having to dig it down into the soil. So I love my finished compost. And I have heard, and maybe there's someone, one of the master gardeners can verify this or tell me that I'm wrong, but I've heard that the eggshells that are often the last thing to break down in your finished compost are actually a way to deter slugs off the plants of your garden, because they slide their bellies over the shell.
I heard that too. Yeah. Yeah, that is really, you know, maybe an extra benefit out in the landscape. I was at the Biltmore estate in Asheville, North Carolina, and one of the horticulturalists was what I thought she was mulching, and then I looked more closely, and basically it was what they call the leaves that were partially decomposed. They call it, I think they call it leaf litter. Mm-hmm. And that's what they were side dressing with, were these partially composted leaves. And I said, well, tell me about this. And she said, oh, this is the best for this mulch, and it's nutrients and it's compost and it's that bioactivity all in one. And I was like, okay, so I don't have to wait until it looks like crumbly Oreos. I can put it out as a broken down kind of almost a mulch too. So I thought that was a great lesson that I learned there.
Yeah, that's cool.
And so a question about composting. Can you do this vermicomposting in the outside in the compost pile as well?
So when you build a compost pile, the worms that are naturally in the environment are going to come up into your bin. Usually compost bins have an open bottom for that reason. So you're going to get microorganisms, but you'll also get, you know, worms and other decomposers to come up. So you don't have to add worms to your bin. They will naturally come. The vermicomposting is really the reason it's a special worm is that those worms like to live in the leaf litter naturally in the environment. And so they don't dig down deep like your typical earthworm. They are happy living in just, you know, a half foot of material. And so they're not going to try to escape the bin is really the idea. So you can, especially in Florida, you can have your bin outside unless it gets too hot. You don't want to have them dried out. So you'd want them in a shady area where they're not going to get overheated.
Right. Well, good. Well, we have our next slide is, we knew about your new book. There it is. It's on the boat coming right now. So Michelle, I want to say, I have an interesting question from Suzanne. And she makes bone broth. And do you think there's a difference between well-cooked bones or cooked or spoiled meat? I have not, she's been thinking about putting it in the composter. She hasn't done it yet. So what do you think about that?
I think the bones will take a long time to break down, although I don't think you're going to get the odors that you would get from, for example, spoiled meat. So I think you're onto something there. It may just be something that you have to pick out of your finished compost and put it back in the bin a couple times before it's really broken down.
Okay. And for those tumbler type composters, should someone put the worms in there since they wouldn't normally get in there? And
that's a great question. And I'll say no, don't put worms in there, but do take a nice shovel of good either finished compost or good soil to get the microorganisms in there. If you put worms in there, when the composter gets to the hot stage, the worms won't have anywhere to go to escape. And so they'll die and just become part of the compost. So, but definitely the microorganisms, because you really do need to add, or to speed up the process, it's great to add that in there. There's microorganisms on the food scraps you're putting in, and you can buy beneficial microorganisms to speed that up, but you can also just use finished compost or, a good shovel of soil.
Of the good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think you answered a lot of questions just in those few sentences right there. That was really good. Cecilia, I love that idea about burying the scraps under the soil in 2 by 2 by 1 deep holes. And so her question is kind of about what I've always called in situ composting, where you trench. Her question is wondering how long you should wait before planting on top of that.
So I typically would wait at least 3 months. And usually you can kind of dig down in there with a spade and see whether it's broken down or not. So once it's broken down, it's fine to plant on it. The only problem you're going to get is that those scraps, as they're breaking down, are pulling nitrogen from the surrounding soil. And so they may steal some of the nitrogen that your plants need to grow. So you could, if you needed to, or you wanted to plant on top of it, you could put a nitrogen-rich soil amendment there, something like blood meal or whatever you have, to kind of balance out that where the food scraps might be taking. But I would think in Florida, with your hot environment, that would break down in a couple months.
Okay, good. That's really great information. Thank you. And Gloria says that her son lives in France and the government provides compost bins to them. So, and I was just mentioning at the beginning with Michelle that in Gainesville, we're beginning a pilot project here, and my neighborhood is fortunate enough to be part of they're going to give us a organic material or compost bin, not a compost bin, but a kitchen scrap bin, and they're going to take it, collect it with my regular garbage and go ahead and compost it. So I think there's more of this afoot and happening for us. And Michelle, San Francisco has mandatory composting of kitchen scraps. Do you know? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes, they do. So if you think about San Francisco, they don't have very big yards, and they have a diversion goal of what they want to reach. So they want to get so much out of the landfill. So they really had to target food scraps. So what they have is a 3-bin system. So they have your recycling bin, your garbage bin, and your green bin for yard trimmings if you happen to have a yard, but also for food scraps. And so you can put all your food scraps in there, even meat and that kind of thing, and then they commercially compost it. So San Francisco's been very successful at that. They have it mandated to where they have people who actually go around and look in your garbage and see, are you putting recycling? Are you putting composting where you're not supposed to? And they'll fine you. So sometimes that's what it takes to get some people to do that behavior. So they've actually been pretty successful at it.
Well, fantastic. And I think we have one last question, and it's about putting potting soil in. And I know what my response to this would be. I just want to hear yours. So she's refreshing her containers and she's going to put her old potting soil into the compost pile. What do you think about that?
Do that sometimes. If I know that, you know, the potting soil has been used a couple times and it's really not something I want to plant in, you're really just adding a nice humus material to your compost. So it's, since you're not adding necessarily nutrients, it's really more of a filler. It's something to help with the texture of the soil. So I added. It's certainly not going to hurt the compost, and it's just going to help add that humus material.
Right. And but I will say everything in moderation. That's what I would, don't overwhelm it. And I think that's probably the case for most everything going into the compost, everything in moderation. Mm-hmm. So even moderation sometimes. Well, Michelle, we have to thank you so much for being with us today and allowing us this amazing book. Thank you for writing such a great inspirational book. We just loved it and learned so many tips and tricks and all kinds of stuff along the way, and got us talking about compost, which is fantastic. So we can't wait to read your next one, No Waste Composting. So that's something else that we can look forward to. So I hope that hope you enjoyed being with us as well today.
I did. Thanks so much for having me. It's been lovely, and I'm jealous of you all down there in your lovely Florida environment, nice and warm.
Yeah, so hopefully we'll see you again soon, and we want to express our gratitude. So thank you very much. And now we're going to introduce our next book, which is exciting. Our next book is the Palmetto Book. It is Histories and Mysteries of the Cabbage Palm, and it's written by a naturalist, natural historian, educator, and activist, Jono Miller. He's a former director of environmental studies program at the New College of Florida down in Sarasota area. And it is going to be a fantastic read for us. It's fresh off the press, University of Florida Press. And the chapters are great. It's going to be so interesting for us as we move along and learn about our state tree. And some of the chapters are about panther killing and birds and the bees and trees you can eat. So I'm hoping that there's a good swamp cabbage recipe in there. He's going to talk to us about log cabins, chikis and tikis. So if you're from Florida, we say tiki and not tiki. So he's going to talk to us about that in the book. And he will be able to join us for our book club wrap up, which will be on June. But we're going to start reading in April of 2021. So we have a little bit of a break. And Maxine Kushner says she remembers Jono from her college days. That's awesome. So hopefully you can tune in. And so this is going to be a great one. It is going to be available from the University of Florida bookstore or the IFAS bookstore, as well as on Kindle and other bookstores as well. So, but it's just coming out this month, so it should be on your bookshelves. But go ahead and go for the IFAS bookstore to find the Palmetto Book. We are really looking forward to it. Can't wait to read with you all this spring. Well, I want to thank you all for hanging with us and coming through book club and commenting on social media along the way as we're reading. And that really kind of lets us know that you're enjoying the book too. So keep up the good work as far as keeping up with us. And I think we're really going to enjoy the Palmetto Book. So thank you so much for being here today, and a huge shout out and a wonderful thank you to Michelle for joining us to talk about the composting book. I hope you all enjoyed it, and we'll see you in June for the next book club.